Hi guys, good to see you. I relocated today to the church that we haven't seen in a while, or at least I haven't, because my next door neighbors were roofing, so it wasn't going to work. But I am so glad to see you, and we are yet another week of going through the Gospels. I am enjoying this series. I hope you are. I know that there's a lot of information here that I think is really important. So today we are on chapter 15 of our Big Fancy Book. And though I know you don't have the book in front of you, you've hopefully been able to keep along week to week as we move through the Gospels. This week we are talking about a new adventure and a tragic end. So in our scriptures come from these particular places. Here we are. Matthew 9:35 through 11:30 and 14:1 through 13. Mark 6:6 through 29, and Luke 7:18 through 35 and 9:1 through 9. A lot of this is pulling from the book of Matthew, but as you can see, that's a relatively long piece of scripture. So I am not going to read it, but I highly encourage you to take a pause of the video and read it for yourself. And there are some things that the other Gospels have that maybe Matthew doesn't, or mention that Matthew doesn't. So those are interesting too. So the theme of today, we are talking about how God's servant sends out his disciples 2 by 2 to preach the gospel message. And if you remember, God's servant is Jesus. So Jesus sends out his disciples 2 by 2 to preach the gospel. And the prophecy that is fulfilled in this section is from the book of Isaiah. It's Isaiah 53 through 3a, or the first part of the verse, which says he was despised and rejected by men. So the Gospel of Isaiah, or the prophet Isaiah, said a long time before this that Jesus probably wouldn't be taken very well by the people around him. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. So as I read our section, I'll stop every once in a while to give some background information that may be really helpful, or comment on something that I think may be really important. So I hope you track with me as we read our story time today. A new adventure and a tragic end. It was a village similar to the rest of the more than 200 Galilean villages Jesus had visited. Small stone or mud brick houses hugged the hillside, and the synagogue looked down from the top of the hill. As was his custom, Jesus went to the synagogue to worship and teach the scriptures. The village people were poor, distressed by the cares of life, and helpless. Leaving the synagogue, Jesus looked at the crowds of needy people. Overcome with compassion, Jesus said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but there are so few workers. We must pray that God would send workers into his harvest." So in this little part, Jesus talks about harvest and workers. So this is kind of him using something that his disciples would have understood to try to explain something else. So in this case, the harvest meant the many people who were spiritually lost or empty, the poor people around him, who were wandering like sheep without a shepherd, Jesus would say, kind of wandering around without a sense of direction or a person to look up to. So Jesus realized that when the time where he was at was the right time, and the people around him were ready to hear the good news. So that's kind of what he's saying, is the people around him are lost in this time, as we are now. And Jesus was there to preach the gospel so that they could be found. About that time, Jesus called his disciples to him and commissioned them to go into the Jewish villages, 2 by 2, to cast out demons, heal the sick, raise the dead, and as they went to preach the gospel. He gave them strict instructions not to take provisions with them and warned them about the opposition that he knew would occur. He called his disciples sheep among wolves and told them to shake the dust off their feet from any home or town that rejected their message. So another comment. So Mark technically is the only one that mentions that the disciples went 2 by 2. Matthew and Luke just don't say. So like, what is the reason for Jesus sending out his disciples in pairs, do you think? Well, I think that, so like the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament mentions how 2 people are better than 1. And I think that's kind of what Jesus was thinking in this moment. 2 people can help each other in making decisions. They can commit fewer mistakes because there's someone alongside them to make sure they're being held accountable. They can help each other when something hard arises, or can make sure people are doing their job when maybe they don't want to. So there are a lot of reasons why Jesus probably sent them in pairs. And a lot of it is probably because we need people, right? We're not meant to go it alone. Especially the disciples had a really hard job in front of them. So I imagine Jesus wanted them to have support, right? Moving on to the 4th paragraph. What an adventure the disciples had. All through Galilee, wherever the disciples went, they did miracles and, of course, preached the gospel. Not everyone accepted their message, but the disciples marveled as they saw the power and grace of God displayed through their ministry. Meanwhile, Jesus journeyed alone. Woe to you, Chorazin and Bethsaida, he said, rebuking the cities that he had seen his miracles. Rebuking the cities that had seen his miracles. I did miracles and you haven't believed. It will be more bearable for Sodom on Judgment Day than for you. To the weary people, Jesus argued, come to me, I'm gentle and humble in heart, and I'll give you rest for your souls. One day, John the Baptist sent 2 of his disciples to Jesus with a question. Are you the one who has come, or should we look for someone else? Jesus answered them, report to John the miracles you have seen. The blind see, the deaf hear, and the gospel is preached to the poor. So this is another part I want to kind of pause on. It seems a little weird, at least to me, that John the Baptist was asking Jesus if he was what they were looking for. John was basically was asking, he was like, are you the Messiah that we've been waiting for all of this time? But you would think that John the Baptist would know. At least I would think. Like, John the Baptist was with Jesus from the very beginning, right? So you'd think he would know better than anyone. So why do you think John asked? It's a pretty good question, I think. And so there could be maybe a few answers. So John was human like anybody else. He could have needed reassurance from Jesus that Jesus was actually the Messiah. Jesus wasn't the Messiah that the Jews were expecting. They expected a Messiah that would free them from Rome and be a great military warrior. And so this Messiah that talked to the poor and preached the gospel and wasn't a war general but was a teacher wasn't what they were expecting. of the Messiah. So it could be that John was like, so this isn't exactly what I was anticipating, right? But the thing is that even though John doubted, Jesus still held him in high regard. So the nature of faith is that doubt still exists. Even the staunchest of believers, including John the Baptist, may have moments of doubt. But Jesus still commended John that any doubts he may have had weren't a serious matter because of John's faith. So it also maybe he could have been asking the question for the sake of the two disciples he sent. He could have sent these two disciples along to ask if Jesus was the Messiah, so that he was pointing these two disciples toward Jesus, kind of steering them in the right direction. At this point, John was imprisoned. He was in jail, and maybe he wanted to make sure his disciples or the people following him were taken care of. So there could be many reasons that John would ask that question, that John would kind of ask Jesus if he was really the one that they were looking for. But John still had an amazing faith, even though he had a moment of doubt. So I thought I'd point that out because I think it's really interesting and I think it's really important. After the two men departed, Jesus spoke about John the Baptist to the crowd. John was not a reed easily swayed by the wind. He was not a man dressed in fine clothes, living in a king's palace. No, John was the greatest of prophets, a man firm in his faith, the messenger who prepared the way for the Messiah. Yet Jesus said, John was only the Messiah's messenger, and all who obeyed Jesus' voice were greater than John because they were part of God's kingdom that was happening in their midst. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Herod Antipas had captured and bound John the Baptist in his dungeon. Herod Antipas, youngest son of Herod the Great, was the tetrarch of Galilee at the time, the ruler. John had confronted this wicked king about his sin in marrying Herodias, his brother's wife. Herod's response was to imprison John. Though Herod wanted to kill John, he feared the people's reaction and did nothing to him. So in this case, John was a pretty important guy. He was viewed by the Jews as a really important prophet, kind of like maybe Isaiah would have been a prophet. So he was very much respected by the people around him. So Herod Antipas probably feared how the Jews would react if he executed the prophet who was really popular. It probably wouldn't have made him any more popular in the sight of the Jews. So I think Herod Antipas was probably worried it was a bad decision. He had a guy in his jails that was hugely respected and was really popular with the Jews, who Herod Antipas was in charge of. So if he would have killed him, it probably would have led to some problems with the people he ruled over. But at the same time, as Herod Antipas started talking to John, he realized that John was a righteous and holy man. It says that in Mark 6:20. And he had begun to listen to John's words and kind of take them in. So after a while, Herod Antipas actually began to look favorably upon John himself, just because he was a great guy. He was a wise man. So those were a couple of reasons that Herod Antipas had him in jail, but it hadn't done anything. It would have been hard because he was a really respected prophet, but also because John was wise. And eventually Herod Antipas realized that. Herodias, too, hated John the Baptist, and slyly she plotted her revenge. Remember, Herodias is now the wife of Herod Antipas. On Herod's birthday, Herodias saw the opportunity and seized it. Herod had a great banquet for his high officials and military commanders. Food and wine were plentiful, and after Herod and his guests had become merry and rowdy from all they had eaten and drunk, Herodias' daughter danced for them. Herodias' daughter wasn't Herod Antipas's daughter too. Herodias' daughter was actually the daughter of her first husband. That's a little confusing to anybody. But all to say that Herod Antipas wasn't her dad. Her dancing so pleased Herod that he made an oath to her. Whatever you ask, up to half of my kingdom I will give it to you. After a quick consultation with her mother, the daughter said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist." Herod was distressed with the young girl's request, but he felt trapped by his rash oaths. Believing he had no other choice, he ordered the immediate execution of John the Baptist. The executioner brought the head of John to Herodias' daughter on a platter, and she gave it to her mother. Hearing the sad news, John's disciples buried his body. John the Baptist, God's messenger, had preached repentance, pointed people to Jesus the Messiah, and humbly said, "He must become greater, I must become less." John's life was over, and though it was a tragic ending, he had completed his mission, and God was pleased with him. Jesus, hearing the news of John's death, withdrew by boat to a solitary place to grieve. So, this story today is kind of interesting. There's a lot of interesting points to it. And there's a lot of interesting things to think about. But one thing that is interesting to me is at the very end of these stories, it says that Jesus grieved for John. He withdrew from and went to maybe the woods alone by himself, and he grieved for his friend. And these are the moments I think are really important to pay attention to, because I think sometimes I am guilty of thinking that Jesus doesn't understand what I'm going through. Or that was like, he lived a long time ago and he was God, so it couldn't have affected him that much, right? But it's important to remember that Jesus was absolutely 100% human too. So things were just as hard for him as maybe it is for us sometimes, and harder. So in this moment when it says that Jesus withdrew to grieve, it reminds me that Jesus was really human. And when I am grieving, or maybe upset or going through something difficult, it's something that Jesus understands perfectly because he's been there. So if you're going through stuff, you have a God that understands and loves you. And it says even in the Gospels that when he was upset, he withdrew and grieved for his friend. So these things affected Jesus. And I think that's really important. Also, like, this passage says a little bit of something about weariness. Which is when you've been tired for a really long time. So this isn't like not getting a good night's sleep last night and regretting it during the day. This is like more like a mother with kids who loses sleep multiple nights and never seems to be rested. She would be weary. Or someone who's going through a really difficult situation and they don't seem to see an end in sight. So this is kind of the really hard weariness that Jesus is talking about right now. But there's a couple of things that Jesus says about this weariness. Though weariness may continue, Jesus promises to be gentle with us and never put unreasonable expectations on us. So this goes back to, like, we have a God who understands and knows us to our inmost being, to our core, and loves us so much. So when we're weary, we have a God that holds us and is gentle with us and doesn't have unreasonable expectations of us. We're his children and he loves us. But secondly, Jesus promises to give us rest for our souls. Which means that even in the hardest times, Jesus brings peace to us that can't necessarily be explained. And this is what he was telling the people. He sent out his disciples 2 by 2 into the villages of Galilee to preach this message, saying, hey, you may be weary, but you don't have to be, because you have a God that loves you unconditionally and will give you rest if you accept it. So this is kind of the message that Jesus is preaching in this time. He sees all of these people who are weary and seem to be roaming with no direction, going through hard times with no one to care for them. And Jesus is instead bringing to these people a hope that there is going to be peace through Jesus if they accept it. So these are some things that this story brings to us. I hope that you take time, if you didn't before, to read some of these passages. The Gospels are our way of seeing who Jesus is. We have 4 books that we can read to see what Jesus' life looked like. And we can pray to Jesus and have a relationship with a God that cares for us and understands what we're going through. So I hope that there's something you can get from today. And I hope you're all doing well. And I'm looking forward, as I always say, I'm looking forward to seeing you all again. It's a crazy time in the world. But if you're feeling weary, we have a God who gets it. I hope to see you soon. And if you have any questions or comments or just want to bug me, here is my email address. I would love to hear from you. And I will respond. So shoot me an email if you so desire. And I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day, you guys.